it's important that people acknowledge that we can be open about our struggles, and that's the starting point. But if we want to change, we don't really want to look at what's going wrong. We want to look at the people who are surviving in this kind of perfect storm of stuff happening in the world, and what are they doing? What are the kinds of behaviors that are they exhibiting? What's keeping them mentally well? And that's what I'm particularly interested in.
Welcome, everyone, to the 1% Edge podcast. Here we have the privilege of meeting amazing guests and having conversations about their journeys to getting 1% better every day. It seems that these days, many people are struggling with mental health. And for today's topic, we really want to talk about how we can reframe from problems into solutions, reframing from what we don't want to what we do want in regards to mental health. And to help us out with that, I'm honored to have Steve Hardy, mindset and change coach, and also a good friend we've developed our friendship over the years. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Carlos. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having you on. Well, let's jump into the topic to start with. So help me define the situation or challenge you're seeing these days regarding mental health.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you hear about mental health everywhere. So I think we're very good at acknowledging it now and talking about it. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, my background, which I'll talk about later, but I was in B2B sales, tech sales. So I'm kind of very much of the LinkedIn crowd, and I see a lot of people talking openly about their mental health, and I think that's a great thing. In terms of the scale of the problem, obviously I get a bit of a focused view on things because I deal with people who struggle day in, day out. But I think the official statistics, certainly in here in the UK, and I imagine it's similar in most countries, is at any given point in time, 1 in 5 people in the UK are struggling in some way with their mental health, which is interesting. And we were talking about kind of reframing things and looking at things a bit differently. I'm actually interested to think about that statistic in a slightly different way, because given everything that's going on in the world, and you and I, we know each other really well, and we talk a lot about the things that are going on in the world, and it's no doubt a moment of change. Whether that's good or bad, who knows? There's loads of different forces coming into play at once. But despite that, 4 out of 5 people are not struggling with mental health. And that's a really interesting statistic. So, it's important that people acknowledge that we can be open about our struggles, and that's the starting point. But if we want to change, we don't really want to look at what's going wrong. We want to look at the people who are surviving in this kind of perfect storm of stuff happening in the world, and what are they doing? What are the kinds of behaviors that are they exhibiting? What's keeping them mentally well? And that's what I'm particularly interested in.
Oh, I like that. So instead of dwelling more on the problem, for example, or diving, because deeper into, getting reaffirmation that things are bad, it's like, hey, 4 out of 5 people are doing great and are thriving. What are they doing, or what are they focusing on to be in that frame of mind? Is that a better way of?
Yeah, exactly.
Did I get that right?
I mean, I like to use the metaphor of a taxi driver. So we never jump in, unless you're James Bond, you don't jump into a taxi and say, get me out of here, I don't want to be here. You tell your taxi driver where you want to be, and your taxi driver is like a vessel for taking you there. But it's interesting when it comes to mental health, the starting point is talking about, what's wrong, where we don't want to be. And we spend a long time in that place, just kind of going over and over and over again of the things that we don't want. And that's quite interesting. No one really thinks about kind of flipping the script and asking the question, well, where do you actually want to be? What would life look like, and get people thinking in that way. And that's that's the kind of headline of the modality that I work in, the solution focused modality.
I like that. And it's much more of a positive mindset too in looking at things.
Yeah.
So I love your stat too about, 4 out of 5 folks are doing great or are happy these days. At least this is a UK study.
It's a UK study. I imagine they're
Yeah,
quite similar globally, yes.
I'm with you. Because you're right, and I hate that I sound like an old man. So my, generation when we were kids, you didn't talk about mental health very much, right? It was kind of, not that it was taboo, but nobody wanted to be like, hey, I got problems. And then the pendulum, swung to the other end, where it seemed like everybody talks about problems. I sometimes talk to younger kids, like, on your dating profile, do you say how many disorders do you have? Is that how you get, become popular? So how things kind of swing sometimes way too far the other way. So is part of this focus on mental health, which is a good thing. Also kind of, it's gotten blown out of proportion a little bit as well. And again, I'm not trying to stifle anybody not dealing with mental health.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying exactly, and I do align with that, and I think it's a difficult one to answer. You've got to walk a bit of a tightrope, but both of us are coming from a perspective, and I know you well, Carlos. I know we're both coming from the perspective of wanting people to get better, ultimately. So I agree. Recognizing that we're struggling and being able to speak openly is absolutely key. That's the first step, and I think we've got there. Also recognizing that people have different neurodiversities, I think that's super important, is really key. Become really good at self-diagnosing each other, or ourselves, sorry. And I often get clients coming to me and saying they've got various different things. Burnout, ADHD. I mean, if I look at the questions that you answer, the test for ADHD, I tick most of them. I don't know whether that's just because I worked in sales or whether I have that kind of personality, or maybe I do have ADHD. But it can be interesting and useful to know what's going on in our mind and what our struggles are. But then we need to do something about it and we need to move forward. And that's that conversation as the pendulum swung too much. Now, if we do identify with the problems in the specific diagnosis or a label, then that can limit our potential to move forward. Because we need to change. If we don't, if we
Yeah.
want life to be different, we need to make those changes and we need to make positive changes. And those kind of things can be limiting.
So it's interesting because, and by the way, I love this approach about, hey, I might have some disorders. On the other hand, who doesn't have some disorders? But what are you going to do about it? How are you going to
Yeah,
move forward?
yeah.
For example, dealing with anxiety. Anxiety is I don't know if I could say this, but I mean it's part of my family tree, especially on my mom's side. And over the years, I've had a lot of anxiety. I don't talk about it very often, but I do. And but I found ways of dealing with it, good or bad. It's just my way of coping with it to be able to do something versus just hiding under the covers in bed. Even my anxiety about public speaking and being on this podcast, I get anxiety from this. Even though people are, well, you're doing it. I go, well, I've had to find a way to cope with it. When you think about anxiety and stuff, are the causes kind of, hey, it's genetic and this is how it happens, or is some of it just environmental and what's happening around with folks? What are some of the causes of anxieties for folks out there?
And that's a really interesting question. And as you were saying that, I'm very similar. I've had struggles with anxiety during my sales career, and interestingly, I was speaking to my cousin. My grandfather was a cartoonist, so unfortunately, he died quite a long time ago. But there's a recording of him on the BBC, the big media in the UK, and they were saying, "Have you always had this light-hearted, personality, being a cartoonist, being humor being a big thing?" And he said, "Well, actually, no. I really struggle with anxiety, and drawing and creating cartoons is my outlet. So potentially it's something that also runs in my family. And there is an element that's genetic. So there's a small part that's genetic, and there's a part that's environmental, and there's also a part that's down to our personality, so down to our upbringing and how we react to the world around us. So there's various different things at play. But the one thing is that the one most important thing is to say that absolutely everyone has the ability to make significant positive change. And also anxiety. We speak about it negatively, but anxiety is a natural state. There's a natural element of anxiety. Some anxiety is good. It gets us out of bed in the morning. It gets us moving forward. And you were saying about, the public speaking. When I come on podcasts or whenever I do public speaking, I always hope to get a little bit anxious beforehand, because I know if I get anxious beforehand a little bit, not too much, then I know that I'll be sharper and I'll recall things easier, and I'll be, I won't just be slouched in my chair, just drip prattling away about nothing. But the other point to make is we all have the same brain, loosely speaking. So we can simplify how our brain's made up into two different key areas. So we have what I call the primitive part of the brain, and that part of the brain was the part of that brain that was developed when we were, our primitive ancestors, however you want to consider them, being like cavemen, cavewomen. Um, and that was about keeping us safe and keeping us alive. So its primary focus was just looking out for danger and reacting subconsciously to that danger. So if you were strolling around like Fred Flintstone with your um, whatever your kind of bear skin on, or however Fred Flintstone looked, and a saber-toothed tiger popped up, you'd want to do something about it quite quickly, wouldn't you? You wouldn't want to sit there and contemplate whether you should engage in dialogue with a saber-toothed tiger or what you should do. You'd need to react quite quickly. So what would happen? You'd get your heart would start racing, your stomach might start churning, you'd breathe deeper, you get sweaty, um, and you'd ideally you'd run away very quickly, and that would happen without you even thinking about it. So that would be the subconscious limbic system, primitive mind, just taking over, putting you on autopilot, because there's no time to think about it. Now, as we developed the ability is some psychologists, neuroscientists see it as being a bit of a lucky accident actually, but we developed this ability to daydream, and we started to think about the past and what's gone well, what we've done well, and start to project forward into the kind of things that we want to do, and making new things or doing things slightly differently, and drawing upon that insight from the past to think about what we can do differently. And with this ability to daydream, we developed the intellectual part of the brain, which is primarily the prefrontal cortex and cerebral cortex. So that gave us the ability to think differently, to think about the future, to project forward positively, to think rationally, to be more considered, to gain perspective. So we've got these two different parts of the brain, and they're both helpful. There's not a good and bad part of the brain, but they've kind of got contradictory roles. So the primitive part just cares about keeping you safe, keeping you alive, and it doesn't like any form of change. So any form of change it sees as potentially being a threat. So it will keep you stagnant. And the intellectual part of the brain wants to move you forward. It wants to think rationally and clearly and gain that perspective. So when we're in that primitive part of the brain, we will feel anxious. We may also feel depressed. We may also feel angry, because these are the emotions of that primitive part of the brain. Helpful emotions, they have a purpose, those emotions. When we're in the intellectual part of the brain, we can come up with solutions. We're more creative. We have that space, that time to think clearly. When a problem arises and you're just able to just say, look, okay, I've got this, I know what to do. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do now, but I know that I can think through it. That's when we're in that part of the brain. Now, unfortunately, that daydreaming, we can also negatively daydream. So we can ruminate on the past. So we can look at the things that have happened in the past and start putting them through our mind and start catastrophizing. We can think about the future, negatively forecast, project forward things going wrong. So we can put ourselves in that negative state of mind, either by thinking about the past, thinking about the future. And our brain, it can't tell the difference between the past and the future. So it will react as though it's happening now. When we'll get anxious, we'll start to get some of those symptoms, and we become obsessive, overthink, highly vigilant. We lose our intellectual mind, we can't think clearly. Sometimes, I don't know whether you're familiar with this, Carlos. I mean, I certainly am, when I've been under a lot of pressure and being asked a question and you simple question and you just can't think of the answer. Your brain's foggy, and that's that being in that anxious primitive mind.
So let me make sure I got that right. So, even though we might look at something from a logical perspective in our cognitive part of the brain, sometimes we might spiral into, well, what if this happens? And our bodies react to it like it is happening to us. So we get all that feeling of anxiety. It starts taking over,
Mm,
and we start having like the same emotional impact if it did something bad did happen to us, but we did it because our minds, are thinking through all the stuff and are
yeah.
basically spiraling to it. Do I get that right?
Yeah, you do. You do. I mean, we don't. It's rare that anyone would face a life-threatening situation in their lives. Certainly not regularly, which used to certainly happen in the past, in like primitive times. But our mind is more likely to be triggered by everyday things. So just a build-up of stress, quite often it's just a build-up, gradual, we don't even notice it sometimes, a gradual build-up of general anxiety. So you get up in the morning and you sleep in slightly and you're running a little bit late for work, and maybe you get to the station and your train pulls away, and these kind of things happen, and you spill coffee down your shirt. You get in the office and you your boss gives you that evil glare. These kind of things just gradually build up throughout the day, and then we reach a tipping point, and the amygdala, which is kind of the key part of our primitive mind, kind of starts to think, okay, now we're in this anxious state, and it looks around our environment and says, why are we anxious? Because we don't really know. It's just built up over time. I mean, none of these are significant events. And quite often, actually, it'll try to identify something in our environment, and it'll say that's why we're anxious, and that's why we can also build up kind of certain triggers, even sometimes phobias that we just don't know why they happen. I mean, I had one of my closest friends. He won't mind me saying this. I won't say who he is, but he won't mind me talking about this anyway. He was speaking to me yesterday, and he'd been on this work trip in the States, and they'd been having a lot of fun, and they'd been having a few late nights, and he hadn't been sleeping a lot. He'd been drinking a little bit, and he was feeling anxious. And he got the plane on the plane coming back. It suddenly hit him. He started to feel nervous about being on the plane, and he'd never had that before. And I was saying, what's happened is with those anxiety levels are built up, and your mind's been looking around and thinking, what is the threat here? Why do I feel anxious? And it identified the threat as being the plane and flying, and since then he developed a fear of flying. So our
Oh,
brains play tricks on us, but they're beautifully imperfect, our brains.
all right. So let's talk about some ways of dealing with it. And I'll share one of mine, but I love to hear what you think is, what are the top three or top four, whatever it is, ways of dealing with it. One of the things when my starts spiraling around, like, oh my God, this deal's not going well, or my presentation's going to be bad, or I'm going to be horrible on that main stage at this event, I, try to focus on controlling the controllables.
Mm,
I'm going to
mhm,
try to be the best I can be and be the best prepared I can be. I can't whether the power goes out or other things happen around me, and worrying about those things isn't helping me, right?
mm,
um,
yeah.
so from your perspective, for folks that are trying to really deal with mental health and anxiety out there, what are some of the top tips to help them to get through some things like that?
Yeah, so you've got a great one there, control the controllables. So there's an inverse relationship between anxiety and control. So the more in control we feel of life, the less anxious, and vice versa. Um, the three or four best ones, I'll give you four actually, ones that we can do ourselves. So exercise, it's incredible for us. So exercise, it helps to release serotonin in our body, which is a positive neurotransmitter, which helps us feel more in control of things and calmer, and it puts us into that intellectual part of our brain. It also, with exercise, when we get stressed, again, our primitive mind is thinking in terms of those real life threats. So it thinks you've got to take action, releases adrenaline and cortisol. But in the modern world, we don't have to wrestle saber-toothed tigers. We don't have to run away from threats. Unfortunately, we're not allowed to punch our bosses, believe it or not, these days. So we can't close off that stress loop. So we can't get rid of that adrenaline. I joke there, by the way. We can't get rid of that adrenaline or cortisol. So exercise is that opportunity to clear it out of our body. When we don't clear it out, you'll see our bodies. Sometimes people, when they're presenting and they haven't got rid of that adrenaline, which is toxic to our body, their body will physically start shaking like that, and that's a way of releasing it. So exercise number one. Second one is community connections, friendships. We're tribal creatures. We're designed. We developed, sorry, not designed. We developed to be part of a tribe. So connecting with friends, colleagues, those real authentic connections, helping other people, feeling supported, feeling as though we're part of something bigger than ourselves. Again, that helps with the release of serotonin. Another one, sleep, is absolutely massive. So sleep, this is a podcast in itself, but sleep helps us to process negative events of the day. So when we rapid eye movement part of our sleep, it takes the emotion out of the negative thoughts, and it enables us to move them into the intellectual mind and process them intellectually. So we get perspective on them. And then the other one is how we think. So positive thinking, and I'm not talking about toxic positivity. So I'm not talking about the type of positivity where you just ignore your problems or wish things away or imagining yourself winning the lottery, but just generally thinking positively, thinking, being forward looking, knowing what you want, thinking what things would look like if you got those things, starting to recognize the things that you're doing well, your positive strengths, maybe some of the challenges in life, how have you managed to overcome them? What were the positive traits that you recognized in yourself that enabled you to overcome these things? So positive thinking, sleeping, connections, and exercise, and some of those things you can do yourself. Sometimes when we get really anxious, we're in like a negative trance-like state, and it can be difficult to motivate ourselves to do some of those things. But if we're able to do so, that's a good way of staying on top of your mental health.
Excellent. All right, so let me get these back to you. So, exercise,
Hmm.
connecting with a tribe of people that really can help you
Yeah.
positively,
Hmm.
sleep,
Yeah.
which is something I'm
Yeah.
struggling with lately, but I'm working on it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and positive thinking. And on the positive thinking, let me make sure I get that right. So, kind of even like visualizing, a positive outcome, and then thinking about ways of getting there, and taking
Yeah.
that nervous energy that may focus on all the negatives and really start focusing on, well, I mean, there's a million things that can go wrong. What's the path where things can go right?
Yeah. So
And what can I do
visualize
about it? Go ahead.
exactly. Sorry, Carlos. Visualization. It's like I was talking about daydreaming. It's when we're anxious, you can think about ourselves as negatively daydreaming or being in a negative trance-like state, I guess. Visualization is projecting forward, daydreaming in a positive way, and we can take that one step further. So the way that I work with clients, it comes from the solution focus modality. So this was created by two psychotherapists in the States in the 70s. They were family therapists, and they were just getting fed up of just clients just not making progress. So working with clients for months, for years, and just things weren't working. So they started to really focus in on the things that did work well, and got really, really focused on those things and identified what worked well. And then they narrowed it down, and some other people in the UK, they picked it up and really started to focus it down more and more. And these are the guys that I trained with. But basically, we can almost summarize it into four different questions. And those questions are, what do you want? I know it sounds like an obvious question, but we often start off a mental health conversation by what's wrong, what do you not want? But no one ever asks, what do you want? And as an example, I'm not problem focused, so I'll deal with people with any kind of challenges because we focus on what they do want instead. But as it happens, there's a guy who wanted to change his drinking habits who came to see me a few weeks ago. And I asked him, what do you want out of life if you're not drinking? And he just stopped there. And he was like, I I don't know. I can't imagine life without drinking. I finish work on a Friday evening and I go out with my colleagues and we just continue drinking throughout the weekend. So being able to recognize what you want is the first step. And then what would it look like if you got what you want? what would it look like exactly? So going in as much detail as we can, and there's almost that visualization piece being brought in there. And then reflecting back, so, what do I want? What would it look like? Well, where in life is this already happening? Because no problem is ever perfect. There's always cracks in every problem. There's always elements of the solution in every problem. So where in life is this already happening? And with that guy, where am I not drinking? So obviously he's not drinking 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's moments where he does have the willpower to stop drinking, and focusing in on those. And then the fourth question is, what would life be like if things were a tiny little bit better? Um, just imagining that, how would I know if things were a tiny bit better? What would be the very first thing that would tell me that things are starting to improve? And what we do when we're able to answer those questions, we force ourselves up into that intellectual part of the brain, and we start to engage that part of the brain. And this part of the brain, it's incredible. So the prefrontal cortex, and we can think of it as like the CEO of our brain, and the cerebral cortex, vast intellectual resource library with so many resources and capabilities that often go untouched, but we can draw on these capabilities to move us forward. So we're able to be in that solution focused part of our brain. But also, the more we work there, the more we start to rewire our brain and start to create new connections in that intellectual part of the brain. And our brains are plastic, so working in this manner starts to change the way our brains actually work, and how we feel and think.
Well, I love that. And, the last part about, what if we could be a tiny bit better kind of goes right back to the core of, what I started the podcast for, what if we can get 1% better tomorrow
Yeah,
or learn something from it?
yeah,
It's every day is getting a tiny bit better and taking a
yeah,
positive step in a
yeah.
direction. So I love all
That's
that.
absolutely, yeah. Sorry. I know you're going to say something, but I just want to make one point there, and I think it's a perfect name for this podcast because all it is about is direction of travel and momentum. So that tiny 1% is significant in terms of our mindset.
Change is hard. So making little changes and then recognizing them can creates positive momentum. Where we think about making big changes, it's hard.
Exactly, yeah, yeah,
And it takes a bunch of little steps to get there, but you got to recognize it. And I know like some of these questions, like, hey, those make perfect common sense. But for our audience, I've worked with Stephen, or I met him a couple of years ago. I worked with Stephen some, and he got me thinking through, some of my own anxiety and what do I really want, and how do I take some positive steps to get there. So working with someone like Stephen really helps kind of guide you through that journey, because sometimes we just get wrapped up in ourselves, right? If it was so simple, everybody would do it. And for some of us, sometimes just need a little nudge and a push to kind of get us in that direction. So I thank you, Stephen, for that.
Thank you. No, yes, thanks, Carlos. Appreciate that.
So, Stephen, if people tell us a little bit about yourself, like how'd you get to be an expert in this area? And what's interesting about it, because you said it earlier, you came from you were a sales rep. You came from the B2B side of business and that whole side of the equation. So, give us a little background.
Yeah, so it's more than 20 years. I mean, my entire career I was in tech sales, started off in software sales and bounced around a little bit, researched, did some hardware, and then ended up in software again. But it was a role that I fell into, so I didn't kind of grow up wanting to work in tech sales. I'm not sure many people do, but certainly not in the UK. It's not a kind of a pathway that we give a lot of thought to. But like a lot of people, I fell into it. And it was great. I loved it. I mean, you earn a lot of money, you do exciting things, you get to travel all over the world, and it's a fast-paced, exciting world, and you work with some incredible clients and colleagues. But it's also a very stressful place to be. And I was always thought of as being a bit of a mismatch for tech sales. So I always think about myself as being more introverted, and because of that, I really had to push myself hard. There's certain things that I felt really uncomfortable doing. I wasn't a natural public speaker, things like that. Um, and I always felt quite highly strung and quite stressed throughout my career. I knew at some point that I would change in the future and I would do something completely different. And I've always been passionate about psychology, how the mind works, and also connecting with people. I think that was been my super skill, one-on-one with people. and recognizing certain emotions and connecting with people. So kind of towards my, the end of that 20 odd years, I started to teach myself a little bit about psychology and primarily to start helping myself. And then within my network, there were clinical psychologists and, friends of friends, and they put me onto different things saying, this is what really works. And I started to study those things and piece them together. And it's ongoing. So I like to continue to learn and sign up for course after course. But yeah, that's what got me thinking. Now, I wouldn't describe myself as an expert because in the solution focused world, we put the client as the expert on themselves, and we want people to appreciate the fact that they're making their own change. But I'm an expert in facilitating change, so I help people facilitate that change by drawing upon their own resources.
Excellent. And I like the way you kind of call it, facilitating the change, right? Kind of walking them, helping them kind of think through some of these things versus imposing on them or telling them to go right or left. They're making their own choices. And I think that's a great way to do it. All right. If I could talk to you forever, but I got to keep these things to about 30 minutes. So final couple of questions. What would be that one piece of advice, Stephen, be it business or personal, that you would give our audience to help them be as successful as you have been?
So for me, it all comes down to the mindset. It's really important. When we have our clarity of mind, when we have perspective, when we have that ability just to take a breath, step back from a situation and think through clearly, everything falls into place. You can get through all of the different obstacles that life throws at you. You can navigate a new pathway. So my advice, and I know I would say this because it's my business, but my advice is focusing on mindset because life is so much better when you have clarity of thought. Work is so much easier. Things are so much less stressful when you're able to, and that's all it is. Just take a breath, step back, think rationally, move forward.
Love it. All right. So, Stephen, if our audience wanted to get a hold of you, get to know you better, what's the best way for them to reach you?
So we'll put a link just below this video, wherever it appears, as Spotify, LinkedIn, and people can contact me through the site. So I offer a free chat, an initial consultation, so I can talk about some of this brain science, and I can show you that your brain is just working normally and what we can do about it, and always happy to have those conversations.
Fantastic. Stephen, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Carlos. It was an absolute pleasure, and thanks for inviting me.
You got it. All right, everyone. That does it for this week's episode. If you find value in our conversation, I greatly appreciate it if you could comment back, subscribe, and follow us. And until next time, I wish you nothing but the greatest success.